going through the book of Deuteronomy. I told you from the book of Deuteronomy about chapter 12 all the way to chapter 26. What Moses is doing is taking the 10 Commandments and putting them in columns at the top. And underneath that column, there's a section that deals with each one of those commandments. There's other laws. Remember, we have the 10 Commandments that we get from Exodus chapter 20, but the Jews really got 613 altogether. All the command imperative moods in the Hebrew, all the command verses in the Hebrew in the book of Exodus, the book of Leviticus, if you count them all up, the rules that God gave Moses for Israel are 613, not 10. So I'll say again, if you took the 10 Commandments, I am the Lord your God, you shall have no other gods before me, and put it up here, there's a section in the book of Deuteronomy underneath that where all these other laws that attach to that commandment fall. And then you go to the second commandment about idols, have no graven images. And then in the Bible, in the book of Deuteronomy, Moses gives a section of laws that fall under the purview of that heading, you shall have no graven images. And then you get to the third commandment and the fourth commandment. And underneath them are all these sections of Deuteronomy that fill in these laws, that give a little more, put some meat on the bone of the skeleton, which is the 10 Commandments. And so here we are in the 9th commandment. We're almost done with this. We'll finish it today. We're in Deuteronomy chapter 24, verse 8. And we're not studying, we're not going verse by verse through this. I'm skipping around and picking things, just trying to give examples so we can see how it is that in Deuteronomy chapter 24, verse 8, all the way to Deuteronomy chapter 25, verse 4, that's the section. Deuteronomy 24, 8 to Deuteronomy 25, 4, these are the laws that arise from the 9th commandment. What's the 9th commandment? It's this, from Exodus chapter 20, verse 16. You shall not bear false witness against your neighbor. So that is the commandment. Don't lie about something that your neighbor has done. You can't trump up a charge against your neighbor. When we go to the New Testament, we hear the command, don't have a lying tongue, don't be lying, don't be liars, stop lying. This is the idea this is the commandment where we get the idea of don't lie from. Don't bear a false witness against your neighbor. Better? So, in Deuteronomy chapter 24, verse 8, let's just look at some of this. This is broken down in 3 sections. In verse 8, he's speaking about relationships with leaders. When you think leaders, it says leprosy. What could leprosy have to do with leaders? Let's look at verse 8, Deuteronomy 24, verse 8. Be careful against an infection of leprosy. And you say, wait a minute, what in the world does this have to do with bearing false witness? Keep reading it. Be careful against an infection of leprosy that you diligently observe and do according to all that the Levitical priests teach you. And I have commanded them, so you shall be careful to do. And then he adds a leader of Israel to this so you get a little better picture of what he's talking about. Look at what it says in verse 9. Remember what the Lord your God did to Miriam on the way as you came out of Egypt. Now I'm going to tie this to a leader and bearing false witness against a brother. Who's Miriam? Close. Moses' sister. And remember what Moses did when they were leaving Egypt? Her and her brother Aaron at one point stood up against Moses and said, is the Lord only talking through Moses? Is he not also using you and I, Aaron? And Miriam led a small uprising against her brother Moses. She bore a false witness against her brother Moses. And what was her penalty? Leprosy. And Moses prayed to the Lord to take her leprosy away from her. And he said, it's going to stay for a little while. So I think she was leprous, if I remember correctly, for 7 days. I don't remember exactly the term, but I think it was 7 days that she remained a leper. And after that, the Lord took the leprosy from her. But you see, she bore a false witness against her brother. You can find that story. We've already gone through it, but it's in Numbers chapter 12, where she actually does that. She gave a false testimony about her brother, claiming that Yahweh was not only speaking through Moses, but that he also spoke through her and Aaron, and Yahweh punished her with leprosy. So that's how leprosy ties into bearing a false witness. So Yahweh's punishment to the false witness in Miriam's case was leprosy. It's about not bearing false witness. Look what it says in verse 16. Another section concerning individual responsibilities here in this idea of not bearing a false witness. In verse 16 it says, "Fathers shall not be put to death for their sons, nor shall sons be put to death for their fathers. Everyone shall be put to death for his own sin." So as if a father would bear a false witness against his son and say, "He made me do it," and the son says, "No, he made me do it." The fact of the matter is, when it's been determined in a court, in an Old Testament Jewish court, who was at fault, the guilty party was guilty and didn't bear the sin of his father. So a son is not going to be imprisoned or stoned to death because of something his father did, and a father's not going to be imprisoned or stoned to death because of something his son did. The law is going to maintain its purity. Very interesting. Again, this is Jewish. Make no mistake about the fact that we're in the book of Deuteronomy and we're talking about the Jewish age, not the age of the church. These rules are not for us. But a lot of these concepts get reiterated and restated in the New Testament. But I think that's interesting. Look what it says in verse 16 concerning the indigent, the lowly, the poor, the widows, the orphans, people that can't take care of themselves. Look what it says, "You shall not pervert the justice." See, don't bear false witness against these people. You shall not pervert the justice due to an alien or an orphan, nor take a widow's garment in pledge. So if you're going to lend something to a widow, don't take her outer garment in pledge, because as it gets cold at night, she uses that thing for a blanket. Verse 18, it says, "But you shall remember that you were a slave in Egypt." So what does God tie to this, not bearing a false witness, treating other people well, treating the foreigners in Israel well? We're talking about non-Jews, we're talking about Gentiles, foreigners in the land. Treat them well. Treat the orphans well, treat the widows well. And God says, because I treated you well when you were an alien in the land of Egypt. You shall remember that you were a slave in Egypt, and that the Lord your God redeemed you from there. Therefore I am commanding you to do this thing. I would say be imitators of God. God was good to Israel when He saved them from Israeli or from Egyptian bondage and slavery. So don't think that these foreigners among you are second-class citizens. We can learn a lot from this. A lot of thoughts that follow over into New Testament thinking. Remember that you were a slave in Egypt. Don't think more highly of yourself than you ought to. A lot of thoughts come to mind. Look at what it says concerning how to care for these folks. God gives an example of how you can care for the orphans and the widows. He says, "When you reap your harvest in your field and have forgotten a sheaf in the field, you shall not go back to get it. It shall be for the alien and for the orphan and for the widow, in order that the Lord your God may bless you in all the work that you do." You've all passed cotton fields, and you pass a cotton field that's just been picked by modern day cotton pickers, and you think, good night, there's cotton all over that field still. Well, in the Jewish age, they were told, don't go back and repick it. Let the orphans and the widows and those people that are destitute come and have all of that. A very caring God. Interesting how He cares for people. In verse 20 says, "When you beat your olive tree, you shall not go over the boughs again." I mean, beat it and shake it and get all the olives that'll fall off of it. But if an olive won't fall, I won't let it fall, because that's how I'm going to care for the orphans and the widows and the foreigners. When you beat your olive tree, and you go over the bough, don't go over the boughs again. It shall be for the alien, for the orphan, and for the widow. When you gather the grapes of your vineyard, don't go over them again. It shall be for the alien and the orphan and the widow. You shall remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt. Therefore, I am commanding you to do this thing. So we see here that Yahweh is gracious and He's a giving God, and He provides for all of humanity, not just Israel. He's compassionate of all our needs and all people's needs. In Deuteronomy 25, as we keep going concerning criminals, what does God have to say about criminals? See, this about not bearing false witness is about justice. Let there be justice in the land. Not injustice, but justice. In Deuteronomy 25, verse 1, remember this goes all the way to Deuteronomy 25, verse 4. If there's a dispute between men and they go to court and the judges decide their case and they justify the righteous and condemn the wicked, so the judge has seen the facts and the court has deemed properly, has heard the case properly and made the right decision, the righteous is justified, the wicked person is condemned, God gives rules here, then it shall be if the wicked man deserves to be beaten. I want you to see if this has any ties to the New Testament, this Jewish law is about beating a criminal. The judge shall then make him lie down and be beaten in his presence with the number of stripes according to his guilt. Look at what it says in verse 3. This should be ringing a bell with somebody somewhere. He may beat him 40 times, but no more, so that he does not beat him with many more stripes than these, and your brother is not degraded in your eyes. So what Yahweh, what God, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob has determined is that when you give someone stripes, when you beat them, when you whip them, they're to be whipped 40 times. Not anymore. Are you seeing any connections here in the book of Mark, Matthew, Luke, John, the book of Acts? Anything coming to mind concerning these lashes that someone was given? Can you think of anyone who was lashed in the New Testament? Who? Who was the apostle that was lashed over and over and over? Lystra, they stoned him to death. Was Paul. Look what it says in 2 Corinthians concerning the Jewish law. Paul says in 2 Corinthians 11, verse 24, I only bring this up to show you that they were living, the Jews that were persecuting Christianity were living according to what their interpretation of the law. And look at what it says here, 5 times I received from the Jews 39 lashes. What a strange number. Why would Paul say they lashed him 39 times? What did we just read in Deuteronomy chapter 25, verse 3? You may beat him 40 times, but no more. So these good Jews, what they would do is they would beat the Christian, they would whip him 39 times, but in case they had lost count, they'd stop at 39 and wouldn't give him the 40th, because, Lord forbid, that would have been lash number 41 if they lost count. So Paul says, 5 times I received from the Jews who were living in accordance with Deuteronomy chapter 25, when they should have been living in the church age as Christians, freed from the law. But 5 times I received from the Jews 39 lashes. Where do you get that? Again, Deuteronomy chapter 25. 3 times, just to finish it, 3 times I was beaten with rods. Once I was stoned. 3 times I was shipwrecked. A night and a day I spent in the deep. And all those things for the name Jesus Christ, just so he could get to the next city and preach the resurrection of Jesus Christ. Everything that man bore in his own body simply to get to the next city to start it all over again when he went into the synagogue of the Jews, as was his custom. 5 times receiving 39 lashes from the Jews. This is where you get that from. Laws arising, let's go to the 10th one. Laws arising from the 10th commandment. Deuteronomy chapter 25, verse 5, all the way to Deuteronomy chapter 25, verse 19. So verse 5 to verse 19, the end of the chapter. This is it, the 10th commandment. Laws arising from the 10th commandment. This is the last section. This is what the 10th commandment is. It's the coveting commandment. You shall not covet your neighbor's house. You shall not covet your neighbor's wife. You shall not covet his male servant or his female servant, or his ox or his donkey or anything that belongs to your neighbor. That is the 10th commandment. And so what we see in this section is desire or intention. Desire and intention is the focus in this section. coveting your neighbor's house, coveting, desiring, intending to have in whatever way possible what your neighbor has, including his wife. That's what this section talks about. Not coveting, not desiring something that you shouldn't have. It's broken down into several sections. I'm going to give you these sections even though we won't cover them all. In verse 5 to 10, he speaks about selfishness in the levirate marriage. Levirate is Levirate. Levir is a Latin word. It means your husband's brother. So the first thing he talks about is selfishness, coveting something that you shouldn't covet in levirate marriage. We'll talk about that in just a second. In verse 11 and 12, he talks about an unfair defense by a wife. I mentioned this last time. We're about to see what it means. It's a very interesting couple of verses. In verse 13 to 16, he talks about dishonest weights and measures. Don't have two different weights in your pouch. I mean, this is how they traded. This is how they did business. They would have a weight that was a perfect weight, and they would weigh out wheat, weigh out grapes, weigh out whatever you were buying with weights. Well, if they had a weight that was too light, they weren't giving you what they needed to give you, what was fair. So he speaks about that. And verse 17 and 19, a desire is about a desire for peace at any price. So what does it say in verse 5? Let's move into this quickly. When brothers live together, this law of levirate marriage. Now I tell you, this section is about selfishness in levirate marriage. But let's look what it is again. We've seen it before in the book of Genesis. When brothers live together and one of them dies and he has no son, the wife of the deceased brother shall not be married outside the family to a strange man. So God's giving another law to Israel as to how to handle a situation when your brother dies and his wife has no children yet. Her husband's brother shall go into her and take her to himself as wife, and perform the duty of a levir, a husband's brother to her. So what happens if you have a brother that dies, your responsibility is to marry your brother's wife, to take her as your own wife, and to have a child with her. That is the law of levirate marriage. Then the elders of the city, in verse 7, or verse 6, I'm sorry, I skipped ahead. It shall be that the firstborn whom she bears shall assume the name of his dead brother, so that his name will not be blotted out from Israel. So you're doing this in honor of your brother. You're having a child with your brother's wife, and that child isn't yours. That child takes on the name of your dead brother, so that his name and his land apportionment in Israel will continue. That's simply the law of levirate marriage. But now we turn to the selfish part of it. Look at what it says in verse 7. See, this section is about desires or intentions. I don't want to do that. I don't want to be hamstringed by my brother's wife. I don't want to have the responsibility of doing this. If the man does not desire because he is selfish, if the man does not desire to take his brother's wife, then his brother's wife shall go up to the gate to the elders and say this. I say these things and I go to some of these passages to show you how clearly it is that the church is not Israel. Nobody in the church is doing these things. You got churches today that say we must follow the 10 Commandments. We must keep the 10 Commandments. And I say to that, we are not Israel. The book of Exodus, the 10 Commandments, the book of Leviticus to the Levitical priests, the Levites, not written for the church. 9 of the 10 Commandments are adopted by New Testament. We've gone over that. The 4th commandment to honor the Sabbath day is not repeated. Neither is this repeated. I only say that because if you want to follow the 10 Commandments as a Christian, if you think that's the way a Christian pleases God, it's not. Read the book of Galatians. But if you think that's the way a Christian pleases God, you can't just pick and serve. It's not a Luby's cafeteria, right? I'll take that, but not any of that. You can't do that. You got to take it all. And part of the all was levirate marriage. I'm sure somewhere in your in your families, a brother has died somewhere, an uncle, somebody has died and left a wife without a son. And I wonder if this was done. And the answer is no, this isn't done. This was Jewish tradition. This was Jewish law. If the man does not desire to take his brother's wife, then his brother's wife shall go up to the gate to the elders and say, my husband's brother refuses to establish a name for his brother in Israel. The man is a clod. He's not willing to perform the duty of a levirate, of a levir, of a husband's brother to me. Even though the law states he should, he won't do it. Then the elders of the city shall summon him and speak to him. And if he persists and says, I do not desire to take her, then the brother's wife shall come to him in the sight of the elders, shall pull his sandal off of his foot and spit in his face. Does anybody do that? It's simply not done. This is a Jewish law. This is one of the 613 Jewish commandments. She shall declare, thus it is done to the man who does not build up his brother's house. In Israel his name shall be called the house of him whose sandal is removed. So it was a disgraceful thing not to take over your brother's wife, not to give your brother's wife a son that he may continue, his name continue in Israel. Look at what it says in verse 11. We move to the second, this unfair defense by a wife. Strange passage. I told you there's only one place in all of the Old Testament, in all of our Jewish writings, in all of our Jewish history, there's only one place in the Old Testament that says anywhere that someone is to be physically mutilated. Remember last time we read an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, a hand for a hand, a foot for a foot. And I told you in Israel they weren't mutilating people. If a man got his eye gouged out, they weren't holding the bad guy down and gouging out his eye. They weren't physically mutilating anybody. I gave you an example of that last week from the Bible. But this is the one exception in all of the Bible where God says, cut a human body part off. If two men and a man and his countrymen, so these are two Jews, if two men, a man and his countrymen, are struggling together and the wife of the one comes near, so she joins the fight to deliver her husband from the hand of one who is striking him and puts out her hand and seizes his genitals, yes, that's the Bible, then you shall cut off her hand and show her no pity. Isn't that an interesting couple of verses? We're not doing that today. We're not commanded to do that today. We're not Israel. But in Israel, for 1,500 years from the writing of Torah forward until Jesus came, in Israel, this was their law. This isn't suggestion. This is a law. That if this were to happen, and if God says it, He's not just trying to shock the audience with something. This is the Lord speaking law into Israel. Look at verse 13 concerning dishonest weights and measures. This is how things were weighed, how things were priced, how things were purchased. Fairness, no lying, no cheating. That's what's at stake here under the 10th commandment. Don't lie, don't cheat. You shall not have in your bag differing weights, a large and a small. You shall not have in your house differing measures, like a measuring cup. Oh, I'll buy a cup full of this, but your cup is bigger so that you get more than a cup when you scoop out. See, that's just all unfairness. It's lying. You shall not have in your house differing measures, a large and a small. You shall have a full and just weight. You shall have a full and just measure, that your days may be prolonged in the land which the Lord your God gives you. And in verse 16 he says, for everyone who does these things, everyone who acts unjustly is an abomination to the Lord your God. Can you imagine being an abomination to the Lord by simply cheating a little bit when it comes to how much whatever you're trying to buy, how much barley you bought. If you lie just a little bit, put your finger on the scale, make it look like there's more, charge them a little more. If you lie just the least little bit, if you are a liar, The book says here that you are an abomination to the Lord. Strong language. Trying to find something here, just popped into my head. Let me see if I can find it. Okay, I'm in, don't turn to it, just listen to me. In Proverbs 6, verse 16, just listen to the list. These 6 things the Lord hates. Yes, 7 are an abomination to Him. Proverbs 6, verse 16 is what I'm reading, 16 to 19. Listen to the list. What makes the list? Don't you want to know what's on this list? What makes the list of things that are an abomination to the Lord? A proud look. Arrogance, number 1. Satan, I will be like the Most High God. Man, every time he sins, I'll do it my way. A proud look. Number 2, a lying tongue. God detests liars. What did Jesus say? I am the way and what? The truth. The truth. God detests a lying tongue. Number 2 on the list. Number 1, arrogance. Number 2, lying. Number 3, hands that shed innocent blood. Murderers. Number 4, a heart that devises wicked plans. Number 5, feet that are swift in running to evil. Number 6, a false witness who speaks lies. Made the list twice, didn't it? A lying tongue, number 2. And number 6, again, a false witness who speaks lies. Can't stand it. Because God is truth. Jesus asked the Father in John 17:17, Father, sanctify them in truth. Your word is truth. Jesus said, I am the truth. God exists as perfect truth. He can't stand lying. I know people that'll lie about what day of the week it is. Just are in a rut of lie after lie after lie. I'm sure you know people like this. These people aren't hard to find. Seems like every family has one. A false witness who speaks lies. From Exodus chapter 20 and the 10th commandment, also from Deuteronomy chapter 25. Of course it's going to make the list over and over because God detests it. It's an abomination to Him. And the last one who sows discord among brothers. So I tell everybody, myself included, maybe myself first, be very careful what you say, because if you are going to be found guilty of sowing discord, you have just made the top 7 list of what God hates among humanity. There it is. Deuteronomy chapter 26. Let's move into Deuteronomy chapter 26. 2 rituals. He's finished technically speaking about the law. We're done with the law. We're not going to go back to the law. We're finished. We're very quickly going to get into the history of Israel and move into the book of Joshua. But I wanted to show you how Deuteronomy handles the 10 commandments and expands on them. That's why we've taken the time to do this. In Deuteronomy chapter 26, Moses is finished with his formal reiteration of the law. Remember, Deuteronomy means the second giving of the law. Deutero means second, and nomos is the Greek word for law. So this is the second giving of the law. It was given first in Exodus chapter 20 to these people's fathers. These people's fathers were afraid to go into the promised land. Remember the 12 spies? 10 were bad and 2 were good. The people are too big. The cities are too fortified. We can't do it. We can't go in. We're scared. And so God says, every one of you, first generation that saw the 10 plagues in Egypt, that saw what I did at the Red Sea, how I killed the strongest army on the earth, the Egyptians in the water. Now, a year later, you're too afraid that I can't do what I said I was going to do. He gave them a 40-year wandering in the wilderness in which He said, every one of you will die. Everyone except except Joshua and Caleb, every of the others will die. The book of Deuteronomy is Moses with the second generation, with those men's children, giving them the law again. That's what Deuteronomos means, the second giving of the law. So he's done giving them the law, and he speaks of two rituals. Once you enter into the land, go through these two rituals. And in verse 1 of chapter 26, it says, "Then it shall be when you enter into the land, which the Lord your God gives you as an inheritance, and you possess it and you live in it, then you shall take some of the fruit of the produce." We're talking about a gathering of the first fruits, and a giving to God and rejoicing for all that God has done. What's the first order of business when you get into the land and you're settled? Worship God, praise Him, rejoice over what God's done. "You shall take some of the fruit, the first of all the produce of the ground, which you bring in from the land which the Lord your God gives you. You shall put it in a basket." This is a ritual, a ceremony. "You shall go to the place where the Lord your God chooses to establish His name. You shall go to the priest who is in office at that time, and say to him, I declare this day to the Lord my God that I have entered the land which the Lord swore to our fathers to give us." After a 40-year wandering in the wilderness, finally this second generation gets to enter the land of Canaan. And what does Moses tell them to do but to perform this ceremony and go in to declare that Yahweh has been faithful to the promises that He made to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He said over 500 years ago to Abraham, "I will give this land to your descendants forever." And 500 years have gone by, and when Israel finally enters into the promised land, they are to bring the first fruits of the land and go to the priest and say, "I declare this day to my God Yahweh that I have indeed entered the land." He's kept His promise. "I've indeed entered the land which the Lord swore to our fathers to give us." He kept His promise. "Then the priest shall take the basket from your hand and set it down before the altar of the Lord your God." That's the ritual. Bring the basket to the priest, make this statement. What's the reality behind the ritual? That Yahweh was faithful to His promise to bring Israel into the land of Canaan. It took Him 500 years to do that. Don't miss that number. God promised Abraham 500 years earlier that his descendants would inherit this land. It took 500 years for them to finally get into it. But God kept His promise. Verse 5, "You shall answer and say before the Lord your God, my father was a wandering Aramaean." Who's he talking about? Read this and see who he's talking about. What father? Which father? Who were the fathers of Israel? There's three of them, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Those are the patriarchs of Israel. The Jewish patriarchs, the fathers. But who's he talking about here? "You shall answer and say before Yahweh Elohim, the Lord your God, my father was a wandering Aramean, and he went down to Egypt and sojourned there, few in number," remember 75, "but there he became a great, mighty, and populous nation." Who's the father that he's talking about? Who's the father that went down into Egypt? Joseph went down to Egypt, but he was not the father. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob are the choices. Who was it that went down to Egypt? Remember Joseph. Joseph got risen to the second highest position in the land of Egypt by Pharaoh after he said that 7 years of famine were coming, and he saved Egypt from famine. The famine was in the land of Israel also. And remember, Joseph's brothers came down to him begging for food. They had money. I shouldn't say begging, but they came asking a foreign country for food. Joseph knew who they were, but they didn't know who Joseph was. And so Joseph sold them food, but he put the money in the bag, and he went through this elaborate scheme to try to find out who these men were. Had they grown? Were they still the hateful men that sold him into slavery or not? And he found out finally that his brother Benjamin was alive, and he said, "Bring back your son, bring back your youngest son, and also bring your father." Who's the father? Jacob. Jacob. That's who they're talking about here. Jacob, our father, was a wandering Aramean. He went down to Egypt and he sojourned there because Jacob did spend the last parts of his life, maybe the last 15 or 17 years in Egypt with his long-lost son Joseph. He went down there few in number. The Bible says, well, in one place it says there were 70. In another place, Stephen says there were 75, the book of Acts. But we can explain that biblically. We won't now. But from 70 people, he became a great and mighty populous nation. So Jacob is the wandering Aramean. Abraham stopped. Remember, when God called him out of Ur of the Chaldees, Abraham, Jacob's grandfather, stopped in Haran on his way to the land of Canaan. Not all his relatives came south with him. Those who stayed in Haran became known as the Arameans. I'm saying this because of this word Aram, Arameans. Who are the Arameans? They were some of Abraham's relatives. Because when Abraham came across, he went east to west and he stopped in Haran until his father Terah died. And when Terah died, Abraham continued his journey south into the land of Canaan. But not all his family came into the land of Canaan. Some stopped up there and they became the Arameans. Remember what I said the difference last week in the women of Canaan? The women of Canaan and the women of Aramea was? Just an interesting aside. Remember what I said when we talked about the fact that the nations that are within the land of Canaan, within the borders of the land of Canaan, God set out 7 nations, the Hittites, or the Hivites, the Jebusites, the Girgashites, all the Canaanites, the Amorites. These people shall be utterly destroyed. Kill everything that breathes. But the people beyond the borders, he said, keep the wives, keep the women, keep the children, keep the flocks. And why was that? It's because the women in the land of Canaan ran their husbands spiritually. They were in charge. If a man married a woman in the land of Canaan, the woman would drag the man into her religion. The Arameans were different culturally, and if you married an Aramean, the man would bring the woman into his religious custom. So let's go back one more fact. Remember where Abraham, when he was dying, went to find a wife for his son Isaac. Where did he go? Did he go to the land of Canaan to find a wife for his son Isaac? Where did he go? Where did they find Rebekah? In Aramea. All the way back up to where he had come from, where his family settled up north. Go find a bride for my son from among my people that stayed in Haran in Aramea. Because those women up there culturally weren't going to lead a man into idolatry. The man was going to lead the woman spiritually in Aramea. Just an interesting fact. The Canaanite women led their husbands in worship, but the Aramean women followed their husbands in worship. Oh, that you women would all be Arameans and choose a Christian man. Again, that's why Abraham told his servant, go north, leave the land of Canaan. Do not promise me, if I die before you get back, promise me that you'll go all the way north to my people in Aramea and pick a wife for my son from there. And that's exactly what they did. Verse 6 says, and the Egyptians treated us harshly. Continues with the history lesson. My father was a wandering Aramean. The Egyptians treated us harshly. They afflicted us. They imposed hard labor on us. Then we cried to the Lord, the God of our fathers, and the Lord heard our voice. He saw our affliction, our toil, and our oppression. And the Lord brought us out of Egypt with a mighty hand and an outstretched arms, and with great terror and with great signs and wonders. So Yahweh performed all these many miracles, including the 10 plagues, on his way out of Egypt. And everybody saw it. Verse 9, he continues with the history. He brought us up to this place and has given us this land. Finally, after 500 years, the land he promised to Abraham and reiterated to Jacob, the wandering Aramean, finally we're entering into this land. A land flowing with milk and honey. So the recalling of this history rejoices at the strength of Yahweh. Just telling this story of the fact that the strongest nation on earth at the time, the Egyptians, once held us captives as their slaves. But you should have seen what Yahweh did then. How He sent Moses and Aaron up to Pharaoh and said, let my people go. What a strong God. What an omnipotent God. What a loving God to hear the cries of His people and save us from the Egyptians. So in telling their story, they can't help but see the total provision that Yahweh had made for them through the years. If only they were sensitive to it, what Yahweh had done. So they will retell their story. In verse 10 it says, now behold, I've brought the first of the produce of the ground. This is all in this what they're supposed to do before the priest. This rehearsing of their history. Now behold, I've brought the first of the produce of the ground, which you, O Lord, have given me. And you shall set it down before the Lord your God and worship before the Lord your God. Not the false gods of the Canaanites. And remember, this is when you enter into the land. Worship God. Remember God. Remember what Yahweh has done for Israel. Remember the omnipotence of Yahweh, His strong hand, His outstretched arm. Have faith in God, not faith in any of the false gods that you're going to be tempted to follow. Whatever you do, don't intermarry with these Canaanite women, because you will fall to their gods and their worship. And as we'll see, that's exactly what the Jews did. You and the Levite and the alien who is among you shall rejoice in all the good which the Lord your God has given you in your household. So the ritual number one, when they went into the land, rejoice in everything that God has done by going through this ritual, by bringing the produce of the land in and reciting your history to the Levitical priest. Remember God. Remember what God has done for you. And in verse 16, we're going to finish this. We see the ratification of the Mosaic law. To ratify a law means to make it official, to make it legal, to make it binding. And so here Moses, in a second event here, is going to make the law official. In verse 16 he says, this day the Lord your God commands you to do these statutes. This is like the sign right here on the dotted line if you agree, second generation of Israel. This day the Lord your God, He commands you to do these statutes and these ordinances. What ordinances? What statutes? Everything that we've talked about from Deuteronomy 12 forward, all of these laws that fall under the 10 Commandments in whatever way. Everything that Moses has taught them, God commands them to do, to keep, to obey. You shall therefore be careful to do them with all your heart and with all your soul. Goes back to the phrase from Deuteronomy chapter 6, the Shema, Hear, O Israel, the Lord is God. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and strength. Borrows from his own line. You shall therefore be careful to do them with all your heart and with all your soul. That's what Moses says concerning the law. Do it. How does Israel respond? Look in verse 17. You have today declared the Lord to be your God. Excellent. We will have no other gods before us. You have declared today that the Lord, Yahweh, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, that this God is your God. He is the Jewish God, not any of the pagan pantheon. You have today declared the Lord to be your God, and that you would walk in His ways. Listen to what Israel promised to do. That you would walk in His ways, that you would keep His statutes and His commandments and His ordinances, and that you would listen to His voice. It all sounds great. Now in verse 18, Yahweh. Okay, Yahweh says, keep my commands. Israel says, we'll do it. We'll let you be our God. We'll have no other gods before you. We'll walk in your ways. We'll obey your covenants, your statutes, your commands, your ordinances, and we will listen to your voice. And Yahweh in response, the Lord then today has declared you to be His people, a treasured possession, just as He promised you, and that you should keep all of His commandments. You should almost underline that last line. The Lord has today declared you to be His people, a treasured possession, as He promised you, and He's also declared that you should keep His commandments, and that He will set you high above all the nations which He has made. He made these promises to Abraham and to Isaac and to Jacob and to Moses. that He will set Israel high above all the nations. Who is the premier nation on the earth? It's Israel. It will be Israel again one day. He will set you high above all the nations which He has made for praise. How many nations praise Israel and the God of Israel today? This isn't a truth today. He will set you above all the nations for praise, for fame, for honor. Well, they're the exact opposite of that in the world. Anti-Semitism, by the way, is on the rise at a just breakneck pace as we get back to a world that hates Israel, God's chosen people. Anti-Semitism is on the rise nationwide, worldwide, I should say. But what were they supposed to be? The praised nation, the famed nation, the honored nation, the nation that was God's own nation. And that He will, that you shall be a consecrated people to the Lord your God as He has spoken. So at this point, Deuteronomy chapter 26 ends, and Moses is completed giving the law to the second generation. There's more he says. Deuteronomy's not finished. Moses isn't dead yet. He's got more to say, but the technical giving of the law has been laid down. I want to turn you just very quickly, because I can't help myself. Look at Jeremiah chapter 7. Turn forward to the book of Jeremiah, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel. So we see here at the inception of going into the land, they haven't even crossed the Jordan River yet. They haven't spent one day in the land that God promised to Abraham, but they're about to very, very soon. Yahweh says, "Fear me, keep my commandments, and you'll be a treasured nation. You'll be an honored nation. You'll be a famous nation. You'll be a nation praised for your relationship with the one true God." And look at how Israel does in Jeremiah chapter 7, verse 17. Let's just read 6 or 7 verses and then we close in prayer. They said they would do it. They said they would do it. You've today declared the Lord to be your God, and that you would walk in His ways, keep His statutes, keep His commandments, keep His ordinances, and listen to His voice. Let's just jump forward in history and see. God remains faithful to His promise. Israel does not. Verse 17 says, "Do you not see what they're doing in the cities of Judah and in the streets of Jerusalem? The children gather wood, the fathers kindle the fire, the women knead dough to make cakes for the Queen of Heaven." Commandment number 1, "I'm the Lord your God, you shall have no other gods before me." Who's the Queen of Heaven? False god. This mother-child cult that the Roman Catholic Church continues to this day. The Queen of Heaven. So everybody, not only the fathers, but the children, the fathers, the women, they're all involved in idol worship. Commandment number 2, Deuteronomy, you shall make no graven images, no idols. So they're making quakes for the Queen of Heaven, not for Yahweh, not for the one true God, for a false god, a female false god. They pour out drink offerings to other gods in order to spite me. But what did they say in Deuteronomy chapter 26, verse 17? "Today you have declared the Lord to be your God." Yahweh is your God. It just didn't last long. You have declared today that you would walk in God's ways, that you would keep God's statutes, keep His commandments and His ordinances, and that you would listen to His voice, that you would obey everything He said to do. What do we read in Jeremiah 17:19? "Do they spite me, declares the Lord? Is it not themselves they spite to their own shame?" This is Israel He's talking about. "Therefore, thus says the Lord God." Now, what does He say before? I just want to show you the difference. The Lord has today declared you to be His people if you'll just keep His commandments. From Deuteronomy chapter 26, the Lord has today declared you to be His people, a treasured possession as He promised you, that you should keep all His commandments. that He will set you high above all the nations for praise, for fame, and for honor. What does Israel choose instead? I tell you, when man is unfaithful, God remains faithful to His promises. Therefore, thus says the Lord God, behold, my anger and my wrath will be poured out on this place. Remember what it said earlier? When you enter into the land in the book of Deuteronomy, take the produce, the first pickings from the fruit, and take this to the priest at the place where the Lord God will choose for you. What's that place? What's the name of that city where ultimately the Lord God chose to build His temple, His worship center? It's Jerusalem. And what are we reading about here? What city? Jerusalem. It's just tragic. Tragic what Israel did with I want to make you a treasured nation, lift you higher than all the other nations, set you above all nations for praise and for fame and for honor. What does Israel choose? The anger and the wrath of God to be poured out on them. On this place, on Jerusalem. I'll pour it out on man and on beast and on the trees of the field and on the fruit of the ground. The fruit that you're supposed to gather and bring to me and rejoice in the fact of all the things that I've done for you and how I brought you out of Egypt with 10 plagues, how I crossed the Red Sea, how I defeated your enemy in the water of the Red Sea. Remember all that. What did they do? We'll do it our way. We'll do it our way. My anger and my wrath will be poured out on this place, on man and on beast and on the trees of the field, on the fruit of the ground, and it will burn and not be quenched. Thus says the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, add your burnt offerings to your sacrifices and eat flesh. For I did not speak to your fathers or command them in the day that I brought them out of the land of Egypt concerning burnt offerings and sacrifices. What he's saying is, it was never just the animal sacrifices that I wanted, it was your heart. I wanted you to love me. I wanted you to worship me alone. I wanted you to choose me as your God. And in Deuteronomy, you today have declared the Lord to be your God. That's what He wanted. But they turned away from Him and they went to the Queen of Heaven and all their other gods. False gods, gods that don't exist. But He desired them to love Him and to please Him, to obey Him and to walk in His ways. And they didn't. Verse 23 says, but this is what I commanded them. I said, obey my voice and I will be your God. Didn't we just read that in Deuteronomy chapter 26? Today you have declared that I am your God and I have declared that you are my people. But this is what I commanded them. I said, obey my voice and I'll be your God and you'll be my people and you'll walk in all the way which I command you that it may be well with you. But what did they choose instead? They did not obey. Astounding, the heart of man is deceitful above all things and desperately wicked. Who could know it? Yet they did not obey or incline their ear, but walked in their own counsels. We'll do it our way. And in the stubbornness of their evil heart. And they went backward and not forward. And this is a harsh truth that God lays down here about the nation Israel, who He still loves, who still has a future. Jesus Christ will come back and be the King of Israel, the King of Kings. He will sit on David's throne. Israel has not been replaced by the church. God loves them. They're still His treasured people. But look what He says about them. Since the day that your fathers came out of the land of Egypt until this day, I've sent you all my servants the prophets, daily rising early and sending them, yet they did not listen to me or incline their ear, but stiffened their neck, and they did more evil than their fathers. An astounding history of Israel. I used to apologize for going into this negativity of Israel, but it's the truth of the Scriptures. I'm coming to embrace it because of the fact that while Israel does everything they'll do, it's astounding to me that God is so long-suffering. If He can put up with Israel and promise Israel, I will return. One day I will come back and sit on David's throne. I will send my son. If He can do that for Israel after the way Israel treated Him, friends, there's hope for all of us. He's a long-suffering and merciful God. He's a faithful God who never turns away from us, no matter what we do as Christians. Believe it or not, He will never leave you or forsake you. He will always be by your side. What a God who remains faithful through everything that man dishes out at Him. Let's close in prayer. Father,